Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Assalamu alaikum to all our friends today. Welcome everyone to MACFEST 2024. Wherever you're joining us from, tell us in the chat where you're sitting in the world. We're saying hello from France, from the UK, and we're really looking forward to today's event. My name is Katarzyna. I'm a member of the MACFEST team, and today we've got an event with the Manchester Museum. So if you do have any questions or any comments, anything you'd like to share, please put it in the chat during the webinar. And any questions we will also answer if you put them in the Q&A portal. Thank you so much for all your donations. We rely on them to create all these wonderful events for you. Most of them are free. If you keep looking on Eventbrite and you stay subscribed to our newsletter, you'll see we still have quite a few coming up until the end of the festival this year. Most of them are free. And if you are on social media, please stay connected with MACFEST. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok, and use our hashtag Spread Honey Not Hate. So today's event is with Dr. Njabulo Chipangura, an anthropologist and curator of living cultures at Manchester Museum, which is part of the University of Manchester. Njabu has interest in empirical ways by which the museum practice can be decolonized through epistemic and aesthetic disobedience benchmarked by undergoing earlier ways of knowledge production, particularly looking at African collections and their representations. Njabu has published several research papers that looks at ongoing debates around the coloniality of museums and associated knowledge production and representation practices to imagine a decolonized museum in Africa. His first co-written book, entitled Museums as Agents for Social Change, Collaborative Programs at the Museum, was published by Routledge in April 2021. Njabu sits on the editorial board of Museum International, a widely read journal on museum practices and theory, which is published Routledge in collaboration with the International Council of Museums. So, over to you, Njabu.
Thank you, Katarina, for the lovely introduction. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Njabulo, Dr. Njabulo Chipangura. You can call me Njabu. I'm the Curator of Living Cultures at Manchester Museum, which is part of the University of Manchester. And I'm delighted to be presenting a talk this afternoon for the second time. Last year, I did another talk for MACFEST, and thank you so much, the MACFEST team, for inviting Manchester Museum to this wonderful festival. And today I'm going to speak to you about this big word called decolonization, which is becoming more like a buzzword in academia, what it means for museums that were born out of the empire to decolonize the collections of objects of the other that were collected during the colonial period. My focus will be on cultural heritage objects from Asia, from Muslim related cultural heritage objects. But I will speak about the whole work that we're doing at Manchester Museum in terms of rethinking the way in which we display cultures of the colonized from Africa, Asia, Oceania, Americas. And also, I'll speak briefly on one aspect of collections that most people don't know, but museums also hold human remains from the colonized. Like, I don't call them human remains myself in my work, the ancestral remains. So I'm going to speak about that. There are no objects as we see them, but these are also the works in which museums, which were born out of the empire, are complicit in the colonial process of dehumanizing ancestral remains of people that they colonized across the world. So I'm going to share my slide with you, and then I'll speak from the slides and thereafter. Okay, I hope you can all see my slides. So the title of my presentation, and feel free to take notes and to maybe interject me as I speak through the chat platform and ask me anything, and then we can get to speak after my presentation has been completed in 30, 40 minutes. So I'm going to speak about the decolonial approaches of Islamic cultural heritage materials that we hold at ManchesterMuseum. So perhaps before I go into the talk, I'm a curator, and the word curator is very, very interesting. Let me break this word down for all of you. So a curator in a museum is responsible for the care. Okay, the word curator comes from a Latin word called cure, which means care. So in essence, I'm responsible for the care of cultural objects, or what we call anthropological objects, right? And these anthropological objects were collected from different parts of the world as a function of the expansion of the British Empire to Africa, Americas, Oceania, the Pacific, right? So when the empire was colonizing, they were not only colonizing territories or landscapes, they're also colonizing culture, appropriating cultural objects, and bringing them to museums in the global north. So Manchester Museum has more than 45,000 anthropological objects of the colonized, categorized in different geographical regions. And we have objects from Africa, the Americas, Oceania, and Asia. So today I'll speak about Islamic cultural heritage objects that we hold. But just as a footnote, to curate is to care. So my sense of curatorship in a decolonial moment is thinking about these so-called anthropological objects, not as objects as we see them from the visual gaze of anthropology, but these are living cultures. Why do we think of these as living cultures? It's because where they were made from communities of origin, these are not just objects that represent the aesthetic beauty. These are living cultures that are made for specific ritual, ceremonial, and secular functions. So when they were dislocated from their communities of origins and placed in museums, they lost that biography, or they lost that history of why they were made and used by originating communities. So at the heart of my work is just thinking about how then can we restore, right, the biographies of these objects by collaborating with originating communities. And originating communities can either be diasporians in the UK or diasporans in the global diaspora, or communities in Asia, Africa, Americas, whose cultural heritage objects are contained in ethnographic museums like Manchester. That's what I think the whole decolonial narrative should look like. Decolonization has become more of an epistemological theory. Most people in academia, we speak about decolonization so much. It's becoming more like a buzzword or a siren where everyone is talking about decolonization. But at the heart of my work, not just talking about it as a theory. I think about the praxis of what it means in practical terms to decolonize anthropological objects that are contained in encyclopedic museums like Manchester. What kind of strategies or methodologies can museums that were born out of the empire implement in order to truly decolonize? And when I say truly, I don't just speak about saying it from a rhetorical perspective. I'm thinking about engaging where communities can also have benefits from interacting with museums, and not just benefits in terms of being collaborated with, but also the whole big picture of repatriations and restitutions of unethically acquired cultural heritage objects. At the end of the day, what is the purpose of decolonizing anthropological objects in museums? We hope that this will facilitate the returning back of these cultural heritage objects to communities of origins, where they will have more value, and like keeping them in a museum under lock and key. So I'll move on with the presentation. So this is Manchester Museum. For those of you who have never been to this lovely Victorian building museum, which is on Oxford Road. So Manchester, sorry, go back to the slide. That's the museum on Oxford Road. So as I said earlier on, this museum was born out of the empire, the enterprise of the empire, as the empire was moving around the globe, colonizing distant lands of Africa, Americas, Oceania. They were collecting cultural heritage objects that were deposited in encyclopedic museums like Manchester without context. Why am I calling Manchester Museum an encyclopedic museum? Maybe that's a question that I need to answer now. So Manchester Museum is the biggest university museum in the UK. In terms of size of collection, we sit over 5.5 million cultural heritage objects divided across natural sciences and cultural sciences. So I sit in anthropology. I'm a curator of anthropology, right? That's just one section of the collections. We also have collections in botany, zoology, entomology, biology, Egyptology. So all of these disciplines of the museum constitutes of a collection of more than 4.5 million cultural heritage objects. That's why it's an encyclopedic museum. It's an encyclopedic museum in the sense that literally, if you ask me a question now, from wherever you're coming from, wherever you're joining us from, I'll tell you like point blank that we have an object in the museum that came from that part of the world, right? So that's the encyclopedia. Like it's a map of the world. Like we have objects that are representing almost every part of the world at Manchester Museum. But the problem is, it's not about collecting, it's about categorizing these objects in accordance to these disciplines. But when you do that, you are creating a museum that is formulated within disciplinary configurations, thereby ignoring the social and cultural biographies that underlie the making of these objects. So objects in a museum are classified, categorized, and quantified within these specific disciplines, thus ignoring indigenous ways of knowing and doing. That's a problem. That's where the problem is. Because as I said in my introduction, when communities are making objects like this, they're not just objects, right? They're not just representing people's cultural heritage. They have a life. They are made for specific ceremonial, spiritual, and ritual reasons. That's why people make cultural heritage objects. They don't make them to be placed in a museum or to be imprisoned in glass cases. They are making them for everyday cultural uses. So the whole decolonial premise is just moving away from the objectification of the other, thinking about objects representing cultures of the other. But these objects are living cultures where they're still being made, used in everyday practices in Africa, Asia, Oceania, and America. If you go to Africa, for example, some of the objects that I see over in Manchester Museum, they're everyday objects. I know them. I've seen them in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Malawi, in Mozambique. They're used every day. But in a museum, they're just stagnant, frozen, and lifeless. As objects that people come to gaze at and admire. So when you think of decolonization, you're moving from that rhetoric of treating objects as static, frozen, and lifeless. So when I do this kind of work, I'm always binded by, research questions. After all has been said and done, I've explained to you the colonial histories of how Manchester Museum was formulated as a product of the empire. So then how then do we think of redoing or interrogating the problems at which we care for our anthropological objects? So my first question is, how can we conduct collaborative provenance research with descendant and or diaspora communities whose cultural heritage objects are contained in encyclopedic museums like Manchester? How do we do this? How can we collaborate with those communities of origins, with those people who lost their heritage? Either there might be diasporans in Manchester or in the UK, or there might be originating communities in Asia. How do we bring them into the table and work with them to redefine the meanings of these living cultures? And then the second question would be, how then can we achieve inclusivity and care in respect of building active relationships between the collections and communities of origin that we hold? How do we build these kind of inclusive ways of working together? Remember, museums have always been exclusive. They've always been exclusive. I mean, it has been a privilege for most people to go to the museum, especially diasporian communities, because museums were exclusive. They were never meant to represent stories of the diasporians in their wholeness, but stories of disciplines of anthropology, archaeology, botany, zoology. In fact, museums are knowledge production centers from an academic point of view. They're spaces of education within the formulation of this discipline. So moving away from disciplines as the priorities of museums, how do we become inclusive by engaging with those people whose knowledge is not quantified as academic? How do you bring lived experiences in museum practices to make them more inclusive? That's the other question. And then what does an empirical practice of decolonizing these collections entail? So I'm thinking about empiricism for me as an anthropologist or as an academic. It's not about thinking about theory, not about thinking about decolonization as a buzzword, which most people are using in academia. It's about walking the talk. How do we walk the talk? How do we decolonize museums born out of the empire with residues of colonization? Because for Manchester Museum and the other ethnographic museums in the UK, born out of this kind of colonial context of collecting, there's no way we can hide from decolonization. There's no way. There's no way. There's material evidence of colonization in these museums. Material evidence. You can see, you can feel it when you come to Manchester Museum. You can feel it, the building itself and everything there. There's this sense of coloniality which is still existing. So how then do we do the decolonial work in praxis? Not just talking about it like what everyone else is doing. How do you practice decolonization within these colonial created collections? And then lastly, how do we reorder these dispossessed cultural heritage objects curatorially in ways that unsettle conventional ways of ordering knowledge by creating space for lived experiences and indigenous knowledges? I think this is a very important point, the last point. When we think about knowledge, in most cases, we think that knowledge is a function of Western rationale. We think of knowledge as something that is subservient to Western ways of knowing and doing. But however, knowledge is beyond just standard Western practices of disciplines. Lived experience in itself, without acquiring an academic degree or whatever in a university, someone can have knowledge from their own lived experiences and knowledges. So this is why I'm thinking about how do we harness those lived experiences and indigenous perspectives and allow them to formulate or to rewrite the story of curatorship within encyclopedic museums like Manchester. So here is a breakdown of the total number of objects that we hold in the anthropological collection or in the anthropological department at Manchester Museum. As I said earlier on, 4.5 million objects is what we sit over at Manchester Museum, which makes us the largest or the biggest university museum in the UK. So the whole concept of living cultures as a curator of living cultures. I'm an anthropologist by training, by academic qualification, but I don't really think what I sit over are anthropological objects. No, I don't think so. These are living cultures. That's why my title is not curator of anthropology, but rather curator of living cultures. It's a recognition that these cultural objects that I care for responsibly. In fact, I don't even think of myself as a curator, honestly speaking. I'm a custodian of people's cultural heritage. I'm holding these cultural heritage objects that were colonized or dislocated as a function of colonial violence on behalf of communities. They are not my objects as a curator. They're not mine. They're not mine. I don't want to lie that I know everything about the 45,000 cultural heritage objects that we sit over. at Manchester Museum. I'll be lying. I don't want to lie. I only know a portion of these objects. So this is a clarion call for curators to relinquish their expert authority or their power by working with communities whose living cultures museums contain. So in terms of categorization and classification or the numbering itself, we have 12,000, approximately 12,000 objects from Africa and approximately 4,500 objects from Asia and approximately 4,000 objects from the Americas and approximately 7,000 objects from the Oceania and a number of, I don't know how I put this word, human remains. It's not even human remains, they're ancestral remains. And I deliberately didn't put a number on the on how many we have from Africa, Oceania, Asia. We have a number of human remains or ancestral remains, but because these ancestral remains were dehumanized during the colonial period, as a curator who's thinking about decolonization, I can't keep on counting these ancestors. That's disrespectful, actually. So the decolonial work that I'm trying to do is not counting the skulls or the limbs of the ancestors. It's thinking about how to rehumanize them, how to repatriate them, and how to take them back to communities where they can be reburied and rest in peace, because these ancestors have been living in these little boxes for a long, long time in museums under the basements as objects, but they're not objects. These are ancestors of living people, and they need to rest in peace ultimately. So there's this kind of work that we are doing at the museum to try and rehumanize and to try and move away from the anthropological category of human remains to ancestors of living people, with the hope that we will ultimately repatriate and return these ancestors to communities of origin, respectfully so. So Manchester Museum was reopened last year for those who live in the UK, for those who live around Manchester, on this 18th of February after a major capital development project called Hello Future. So I was involved as a curator in most of the exhibitions that are now showing at Manchester Museum. We have actually four new sections or four new galleries that speak to this whole idea of museums decolonizing themselves through co-curatorship and co-production. So we've got a new China Culture Gallery, a very impressive gallery that speaks about the story of Chinese heritage, co-produced by Chinese diasporans and co-produced in collaboration with Manchester China Institute, which is part of the university. So what we did with the Hello Future, instead of thinking of curators like myself as hegemonic experts in disciplines, we opened ourselves to different ways of knowing and doing by collaborating with diasporans who are now part of the curatorial processes, part of the core curatorship. So they brought with them, the diasporans, brought with them their own stories and their own meanings and understandings of cultural heritage objects that we have in the museum, and that they brought with them from their own homes to tell the stories of being diaspora in the UK. So the other gallery is called the South Asia Gallery. It's an impressive gallery co-curated by 30 co-curators of South Asian heritage who came together to tell their stories of what it means for them to be South Asian, what it means for them to be from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from India, from Nepal, being in the diaspora in the UK. And they were allowed to tell their own stories in Manchester Museum through this new exhibition, which was done in collaboration with the British Museum. And this exhibition has won numerous accolades, numerous awards. And my colleague, Nusrat Ahmed, she's not here today. She's the one who was the lead curator on this exhibition, this co-produced exhibition called South Asia Gallery. So this is decolonization in a sense. This is what we mean by decolonization in praxis, right? Remember my opening research questions. How do we do decolonial work practically? What can we do? So in trying to answer these questions, Manchester Museum came up with this notion of co-production or co-curatorship, which respects and acknowledges that diaspora and Asian communities in Manchester can have a say in the ways in which their heritage is represented. That led us to the formulation of the South Asia Gallery, which most people describe it as co-curatorship at an epic scale, because it's, bringing together 30 co-curators into the museum to tell their own stories about being South Asian and how it means for them in being South Asian in Manchester or in the UK. Was not an easy feat. The first of its kind in the UK, the South Asia Gallery, co-produced by diasporans. And then this is where we say Manchester Museum is practically implemented a decolonial methodology called co-curatorship. It's not just about talking about decolonization, as a language of instruction is what most academics or what most museums do. It's about doing the work, and the work is reflected in the production of the China Culture Gallery and the South Asia Gallery at Manchester Museum, which was born out of a partnership with the British Museum. And we've got the Belonging Gallery, again, the story of belonging, what it means to belong to a space, to a place in terms of cultural heritage objects. How can we represent the story of belonging by looking at cultural heritage objects that we contain in the museum? So we brought a number of comic artists from around the UK, diasporans as well, to speak about the story of belonging and to represent their own narratives by putting together comics of representation. So to us, using comics was more like a curatorial disruption methodologies. Because remember, in the past, curators were the voice of authority, right? I would pick an object for myself from the basement, display it, tell the story that I think is appropriate from my curatorial head. But now we're saying, no, it's not about the curator is the sole authority of knowledge. It's about bringing artists to the space and allowing this artist to represent their narratives. So that's what we did in Belonging. We brought comic artists together to do comic artistic representation in their stories. Okay, sorry. I don't know why I'm rushing now. So this is the South Asia Gallery, a picture of the South Asia Gallery. As I said, it was a collaboration between the British Museum and Manchester Museum. We brought together a group of co-curators, actually it's 30 co-curators, not 23, from South Asia diasporans who live in Manchester mostly. So this gallery represents a compelling contemporary take on South Asia and British Asian history and culture. It's the first permanent gallery in the UK to celebrate the stories and experiences of South Asian diasporans. So, I don't want to seem like I'm blowing my own trumpet in a sense, but if you go through the reviews of this exhibition, actually recently on Wednesday, we won an award for this exhibition, and there have been many other awards that we've won for coming up with this concept of co-curating, co-producing, and working with diasporans and telling their own stories at Manchester Museum. So that's just a visual impression of the gallery. That's a rickshaw that was done by an artist from Bangladesh. So we brought in an artist from Bangladesh who came to Manchester to work with us for two weeks. He was in the building and he had to reconstruct into a remade. A rickshaw is a popular kind of cultural object within South Asia. So we have one on display, this one, and we have another one that the same artist made, which is open for hire by people who would want to use the rickshaw for different kind of festival activities like weddings and other things. So the other one is open for hire. Again, this is a different kind of take for museums, right? Museums are known for preserving or conserving objects forever, for posterity, I'll say. But for us, it's not just about thinking of putting these things in a glass case. This rickshaw is not even in a glass case. It's open in the display. And if you want more about the rickshaw, you can come and have the rickshaw, sit on the rickshaw and take it out from the museum. That's a fundamental change from old ways of preservation and presenting objects in a museum, which is where this whole decolonial work that I do supposedly, I think, sit over. And then that's the China Culture Gallery, which was made in collaboration with Manchester China Institute. It showcases China cultural objects from the Living Cultures collection. And a lot of Chinese stories are told from an indigenous Chinese perspectives, and these were generated by diaspora Chinese communities in Manchester from their own perspective as well. And you can see even from the caption there, the language is not just English. We've also used Mandarin to tell the story of China in Manchester through co-production and collaborative practices with Chinese diasporans. That's part of the China Culture Gallery. Now, let me move on to the Muslim kind of aspect of the collection and the collectors. So there's one famous collector who went around mostly the Persian Gulf to collect a number of Muslim objects called Thomas Guy Anderson. So Thomas Guy Anderson was born in 1881 and died in 1960. He was an Irish-born military officer, an art collector, and a painter. Commissioned into the Royal Field Artillery, he served in the Boer War and the Sudan War, gaining admiration for Australian forces during the Gallipoli campaign. Thomas later held various military positions, including Constantinople and India, before retiring to Suffolk. An art-passionate lover, he and his twin brother, Robert, amassed an impressive collection of miniatures and paintings from all over the world, including India and Egypt. So, I mean, the history of museums in itself cannot be told without thinking about who were these people who were collecting and for what purposes were the people collecting objects that later on found their ways in the museum. So I'm just giving you a sense of the collecting histories of museums. Of course, we talk about colonial violence. Yes, these collections were collected within a colonial period. Some of the collectors were just enthusiasts, but because they were working for the empire, we can't separate their motivations of collecting from colonization. This is a deeply problematic issue where some people say, oh, museum objects were donated. They might have been donated, but look at the temporality or the time at which they were donated. These people were working within a colonial period. So it's most likely that the power dynamics, even when they were purchasing the objects, as they call them, purchases, the power dynamics at that point of time will not be the same as today when people are purchasing in an equitable relationship. So the whole colonial project might not necessarily be about appropriating and looting, but also collecting from purchases and donations at that particular point in time where there were inequalities in terms of power geographies and power dynamics. We need to be aware of that as well, is what Thomas Guy Anderson was doing. So here's an example of one object that is part of our collection in the museum. This bowl is from Persia. Very lovely, interesting. The interior of the bowl is undecorated, apart from piercing of the marks, as you can see from there. There's a layer of glaze covering the perforation, creating a glassy window and gathering thickly 2/3 of the way down the bottom of the interior. So this is just an anthropological description. So that's what we have on this object from Persia. But we don't know, apart from just describing it from this anthropological category, that is, it looks lovely and beautiful. We don't know why it was made, who made it in that Persian Gulf, who made it, and for what purpose. So this object sits in the museum as one of these frozen, static, lifeless objects that was collected during the 13th or 12th century AD, but we don't have adequate provenance information. So the work that I do with these cultural heritage objects is opening up to communities of origin, diasporans in Manchester, and originating communities. Can we work together to understand the salient histories of these objects and try to check which communities of origins are still making and using similar kind of cultural heritage objects? And then again, this is another interesting collection coming from the Southwold donation. So this So I was brought into the Manchester Museum collection in 1969. There was an exchange of objects between Salford Museum and Manchester Museum. So we got a number of anthropological objects from that exchange, including this pair of shoes from Turkey or Asia. And the reason why I'm putting that question mark, that's how the objects are labeled in the museum. The question mark tells you a story about uncertainty of whether what is Asia, what is Turkey, because Asia and Turkey, they're two different places, right? But the collectors were not even sure. They were sure where they got these objects from, but because they were collected within a particular context of colonization, when people are collecting objects in a colonial moment, they don't worry about context. They just taking and grabbing. As a result of that, we don't have adequate contextual information on where exactly in Asia these objects came from. They might have come from Turkey, or they might have come from anywhere in Asia. So that's the part of the work that I'm trying to do as a curator, to establish the proper context and provenance of these objects that were collected or even looted during colonization. And then we have this candlestick, mostly from the description from the early anthropologist, it's a 15th or 14th century object. Many Muslim potters from Nusrat region of South Spain, who gradually migrated to Valencia region, were making similar kind of cultural objects. These objects, this candlestick, is mainly associated with the Valencian towns of Maniz. These wares were decorated with a range of floral and geometric motifs, and all styled within Latin phrases of the Gothic script. They were widely exported to Italy, France, England, and sometimes commissioned by noble families whose insignia were incorporated to the designs. Over time, the Italian imitations and innovations, including Maluka, came to dominate the market, and the quantity of the Valencian lastware. So this is more from the anthropological description of things. This candlestick, okay, it came from 14th and 15th century Muslim potters of the Nazareth region of Valencia. That's all. That's all we know. That's all that the description contains and carry. So the work that we're doing to decolonize such kind of early anthropological narrations is to open these collections to people, communities, and allow them to come and see them. And then perhaps we can develop more nuanced stories on who and how these objects were made. And we think, because they are living cultures, we might still see communities in these areas of origins making similar kind of objects, which shows us that objects, they don't die when they come to a museum collection, right? They can still live, but because we don't know where they came from, they are frozen and static in museum basement. So our call for action is to work with communities originating or diaspora communities to redefine the biographies of these objects in this whole decolonization moment. We also have got this Islamic dish, just labeled Islamic dish. That's it. There's nothing more that we know about this Islamic dish. So we don't know where exactly it came from. Only written Islamic dish. So again, the decolonial work that we aim to do is to work with communities of origins. And anyone maybe in this room who's interested in understanding or working with Manchester Museum to redefine the meanings of these Islamic cultural heritage materials, you are free to contact us. We can give you more information, and then we see how we can collaborate to redefine the meanings of these objects that are not known in museum categorizations. Another one, again, just written Islamic bowl. And the description is, the bowl is a dark brown bowl with cream trellis decorations. Call for action again. We're looking for more information on the provenance. It's written in Morocco or North Africa with a question mark. So might have been from Morocco, maybe from Tunisia or from Egypt. We don't know. We don't know. And that tells you the stories of colonial violence or colonial appropriation. Because as I mentioned earlier, when people are just looting and appropriating, who cares about context? We don't care. People just care about cultural representations. And then they forget where they got the objects from when they depose them in the museum. That's why you see a lot of question marks on museum objects like in this case, it's Morocco, North Africa, question mark. So it can either be from anywhere in that region as well. And then we have this cup. It's an Islamic cup again, written an open cup with two handles. It's painted dark brown with an off-white and gray geometric display or design with what looks like outstretched arms on the upper section of each side of the chamber. There's a flat base, probably from Morocco. Again, question mark. So, I mean, this is where the whole work of decolonization must be premised on. The provenance research has to be undertaken to establish if at all this cup came from Morocco and from where in Morocco. And this is easy to do because when you work with communities of origins or diasporans, some people might have seen similar cups in their lifetime, right? Then they can give us information on where they've seen these cups. And then you can generate new knowledge outside academia, outside anthropology, where these objects were collected from, right? So we democratizing knowledge production in museums. The way we can do this is by acknowledging that there are different ways of knowing and doing, which can be harnessed by working with communities and embracing their lived experiences as a form of knowledge. Another one, problematic as well, edition Bao, probably from the Middle East. That's all we know about the subject. And there's no adequate provenance research as well, provenance information. So we're working as well to think about how we can get the information from collaborating with communities of origin as a decolonial methodology. Now, let me just conclude or round up my talk to open up for questions with a very interesting concept that I really like and work with called curatorial humility. So after all has been said and done, I mean, I've established that the history of museums in Europe, especially Manchester, is deeply embedded with narratives of colonization. So in this decolonial moment, how then can curators practice a form of humility? So curatorial humility is an epistemological and methodological approach that incorporates reconciliation, critical reflexivity, and reciprocity with originating communities to address exclusions of the past, where curators like me used to speak on behalf of the communities. No more. Curators cannot speak on behalf of the communities. Curators should facilitate dialogue with communities. Curators should ensure that museums become inclusive and become spaces of active dialogue. So this concept challenges curatorial silencing, epistemic injustices, and paternalisms in museum. It promotes open disclosure, truth-telling, and accountability by acknowledging the role of colonial violence in the making of ethnological museums in the global north, like Manchester Museum. So it's a decolonial methodology in a way. It starts off by acknowledging and truth-telling that histories of museums like Manchester are quite problematic because of the colonial structuring. And for us to move on, we need to practice a form of empathy and work with communities on an equal footing, communities of origin or diasporans, in redefining the meaning of these silenced or imprisoned cultural heritage objects in museums. And then I briefly spoke about rehumanization and the category of human remains, which is problematic in a whole lot of ways. As you can see from that picture, those are human remains. Those are ancestors of living people in museums, at Manchester Museum, in our organic stores. They come from all over. I've picked pictures of objects, or sorry, human remains or ancestors from Asia, clearly written from the labels, headhunters trophies. These are collected as headhunters trophies. Like when the colonized were defeated after maybe refusing colonial encroachment, they were killed and their heads were taken down, chopped off, and taken to museums like Manchester. we have these dehumanized subjects as objects. So for me as a curator, I'm thinking about how then do we rehumanize these objects or these ancestors by lifting the binary division that separates us from here, from them in museums towards establishing new forms of mutually working together. So the act of rehumanization in museums fundamentally address how both ancestors and living cultures from the colonized were dehumanized by racial studies that actively pursued at that time notions or principles of anthropology and archaeology. Then what does it take to be human again, where we treat ancestors with respect, dignity, and at the same time restore the biographical life of objects that were looted at the height of colonization? The answer is, in a decolonial moment, ancestors are not material manifestations of a particular historical time that are waiting to be measured, sampled, studied, and genetically analyzed. Instead, they are living cultures. For example, in an African worldview, spirits of the dead will forever linger in museum storage rooms until the ancestors are properly buried. So for me, museums must let the ancestors rest in peace. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for this lovely presentation. I could not see any questions in the chat. If anybody has any questions, please put them now. We will answer them, hopefully all of them. And in the meantime, I do have a question. It's not an easy one. But how easy or how difficult is it to challenge the current point of view that is built upon the education that was then, in the past created to fit certain narratives, probably managed by money and politics, so they would fit in the view that, was comfortable for those who decided what was going into the books and what wasn't. How easy is it to navigate around that?
Good question. Good question. That's a good question. Actually, I think it's not easy at all. Like, for example, Manchester Museum is part of the University of Manchester. It's a university museum. So without even thinking about challenging the establishment of how this museum was formed, we are sitting within a range of academics who still feel that the university is a space of knowledge production. The university is a space of teaching, or you can come and sample, measure human remains and teach about culture of the other, right? So there is still a sense of antagonism. I don't want to lie to you. I mean, the whole decolonization work that I do, it's not very comfortable. There are challenges that I face almost every day in terms of doing the right work or doing the right, I wouldn't say representation of people's cultures, but allowing cultures of people to be told by lived experiences. Lived experiences are not seen as a form of knowledge in universities. It's either you are doing what I call standard scientific knowledge production through discourses of discipline, or whether you're doing nothing. So when you try to bring those communities to the museum and make them curators, there are people who have been trained academically to be curators, who have gone to school to study degrees to become curators, to get PhDs. So in a sense, you're challenging the authority of those people and saying, no, we can have someone who can come and talk about these cultures without a degree. That's a challenge. But again, I think it's a very delicate balance. I don't want to lie to you. How you navigate those kind of intricacies to try and perform decolonial work. But there are many hurdles. I think, remember last year, if you were in Manchester or you're around, Manchester Museum, we repatriated some cultural heritage objects to a community in Australia called the Andbiographies, 174 cultural heritage objects. And it came with a prize for us. I mean, it was a well done work for us to acknowledge that these objects need to go back to the community. But there were many university academics who were against that work that we're doing. Because for a long time, this collection that came through from a British professor called Peter Worsley was used as a teaching resource for the university. So then how do you balance those new ways of representation where you say, okay, objects are not just objects in a museum, they are living cultures. We need to bring narratives of the people who make the object to tell their own stories, and we need to facilitate the repatriations of these objects back to communities where they have more value than being in a museum. So it's a very good question that you've asked me. It's not only about political, economic interests of other people, it's also about academic interest. Sitting in a university museum like Manchester, how do you move forward with this work, which is antagonistic to normal discourses of knowledge production?
Yes, I can see the role of communities, bringing people together, and these people will bring the strength to your approach. Yeah, and they can bring the stories in. They can give you the answers that you don't have, and they can bring you the truth, hopefully, if
Yes,
it was shared in the families.
of course, of course, of course. And lived experience for me
Yeah.
are more important than academic experiences. Because when you speak about culture, culture is culture of the people, right? You know your culture. And you don't need to go to school to understand your culture. Do you? No, I don't think so. It's lived every day. I think that we do almost every day.
Yeah.
We relate it every day. So it's not about anthropology as a discipline. It's about your lived experiences, your cultural activities that you've grown up in, that you've lived it for your life, that you can tell easily without having a degree in anthropology or archaeology. So it's a very good question, but there's a delicate balance in the way that I work as well as a curator in a university museum.
And is there a long list of things that have been hidden from us
Yes,
through?
yes, yes. Yeah, so what you see in the museum there is just 1% of what we hold. I don't think it's 1%. I think 0.5%. Because remember I said we have more than 4.5 million objects, right? But when you come to our exhibitions at Manchester Museum, you only see a tiny fraction. Everything else is in the basement. We've got 3 basements, 3, 4 downstairs where objects are kept. So there's quite a lot that you don't see. It's up to me as a curator to bring them up, to exhibit them, and to show you. Other than that, those objects will remain lifeless, frozen, static, and hidden from the public.
And are there any things, and is there anything you're not allowed to disclose or not allowed to talk to? Any narratives, any history, facts, anything,
It's a community question, actually. It's not my question. It's about cultural restrictions and cultural sensitivities. So when we work with communities, they can identify for us objects that are restricted. Like, for example, some objects or living cultures are men's only business or women only business, right? Those are not open objects. They're not viewed by everybody. But the question is, as a curator with an academic degree, you wouldn't know about these restrictions if you don't collaborate or work with communities. You can
yes.
only get hints about cultural sensitivities from communities. When you bring them to the museum, they'll be able to tell you that, no, this object that you have in your basement is not supposed to be viewed by this group of people. Put it away and make it men's only or women's only. See, so there's what we call open cultural materials, which are open to everybody, and restricted cultural heritage materials, which cannot be seen according to gender binaries and gender divisions. So yes, you're right. But the only way that you can be able to make that differentiation is collaborating with communities who can tell you the gender dimensions and cultural sensitivities associated with the cultural heritage objects.
And in what way are you connecting with the different communities around the world? Because I suppose you need to have some links with the different countries,
Yep.
different parts of different continents.
Yeah.
How does that
So
work?
yeah. So we have. I think I'll speak. Well, from an African perspective, where most of my work is around African cultural heritage, blindly so because I'm from Africa, from South Africa, Zimbabwe. So I've been trying to work with communities or colleagues or international museums in that part of the region, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, because the biggest chunk of the anthropology collection that we hold came from Africa, more than 15, 16,000. And rightfully so, because the empire was almost everywhere in Africa, right? So they're almost colonizing every part of Africa. So I have been working, yes, with some of those museums in Africa and museums that were established in colonies. They are similar to what you see in Europe, right? They're byproducts of colonization. That's too similar anyway. So the whole colonial project is not just about the metropole, right, or the UK or whatever. It was also transposed to India, right? The whole colonial project is similar. It's similar to South Africa, to Australia, to Canada, to America. All those settler colonies, they still mimic the ideas of colonization that was brought by the empire. So in Africa as well, we have African museums that I'm working with that are grappling with the same questions of decolonization. So yes, I do have active collaborations with international partners in Africa.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this. We're going to wrap up with one last comment from Heather. Excellent thought-provoking presentation. I work in the field of understanding ancestors in museums in an ethical manner, and I very much appreciate your approach to this idea of ancestors are living cultures. So thank you so much for this. If anybody has any questions after the event, you can always put them on our Facebook page, where you can watch this event once again because it has been recorded.
Thank you so much, Njabu. I just wanted to say that to him personally. That was absolutely riveting. We've had a lot of wonderful comments, and Katarzyna has read them. I've learned an awful lot behind the scene, something we never even knew about it. I think I would like to go to your museum. Luckily, I live in Manchester, to actually go downstairs in your basement to see, go on a tour of some sort.
Yes, I would want to take
that?
you down. If you have got time, I would want to take you down. What I'm saying to you, all of you now, might make sense if you come to the museum, and I'll bring you down to where these objects are hidden.
Wow.
And then you realize that there's so much that we can do together to rethink the category of Islamic objects or African objects that are hidden away from the community. So
amazing.
I'm really willing to take whoever is in Manchester. My approach is very open. Write to me, and then I can take you to these objects. You can see them and experience colonization in real time.
Thank you. Katarzyna, back to you.
Thank you so much, Kezra, for being with us today. Kezra Shiraz is the founder and executive director of MACFEST, for those who don't know. Before we go today, we've got a fantastic event tomorrow, International Youth Speak Out on Environment. You've got to see those kids. They are absolutely amazing. We do have an exciting photography event on Sunday, 26th of May. You look up on Eventbrite the whole description. I can just say that this is an amazing event about the culture and identity with the twin brothers, Aesop brothers, photographers, and that is Hello from South Africa. And if you are an artist or a creative, or you know somebody, please look up on our website, MACFEST Arts Awards. It's an excellent opportunity for a recognition for creative Muslim people. Entries are now open. The submission process closes on the 30th of June, and submissions are free. So if you have any works that you would like to show, please submit them through the website. Thank you very much for today, and hopefully see you, most of you, tomorrow. Thank you, Njabu. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.